In this nugget, I'd like to demonstrate how we can, if we want to, deploy the vCenter Server appliance as a virtual machine running in VMware Workstation instead of running it as a VM in ESXi. Let's begin. In the previous nugget, we deployed the vCenter Server appliance as a virtual machine that's running on ESX1. And for a lab environment, for us anyway, that's not really that optimal because we may need to do things like snapshot this ESXi host or shut it down. And we'd like to be able to do all of that without impacting the vCenter server function. So what I'd like to do in this nugget is I'd like to walk you through how we can deploy the vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. So that means that the vCenter server appliance will join the Active Directory server, which is also a VM running in VMware Workstation, as well as the ESXi1 and ESXi2, which are also running as VMs. And effectively, this vCenter server appliance will be at that same level as another virtual machine being provided by VMware Workstation. Now, to make that happen, we need to do a couple of things. Number one, we need to take the virtual machine that we just deployed for the vCenter server appliance, and we need to go ahead and power that guy off. We don't want to have two devices on the same network with the same IP address and everything else because that's going to cause problems. So what we'll use to do that is we'll use the Windows client, and then from the Windows client, we'll simply power off that virtual machine. Or if we want to, we could just completely delete it. I think I'm going to play it on the safe side and just power it off, leave it off, but not completely delete it. That way, if for some reason I need to go back to that virtual machine and actually use it as a vCenter for whatever reason, I know at least I have it there sitting if I need to power it on and use it. So back to our process here. Once we power off that device, we are going to go to the ISO image for the vCenter server appliance, and we are going to grab the OVA file and add an OVA extension to it. Now, in one of our nuggets coming up, we're going to talk about the functionality of the open virtualization format. It's effectively how we can take all of the contents of a virtual machine and sort of like zipping it all up and putting it into a package. And one of those options is an OVA extension. So for example, if we had a computer called vm1.ova, we could use that OVA file to import that virtual machine and all of its details into a virtual environment. For example, into VMware Workstation or into an ESXi host. And it's a very rapid way to deploy a virtual machine. So there is an actual OVA file for the vCenter server appliance, except on the CD, it does not have the OVA extension. So we're going to want to go ahead and extract that CD, add the .ova extension, and then we'll go ahead in VMware Workstation and we'll import that vCenter server appliance OVA file, which when we're done, will create this virtual machine sitting in VMware Workstation. However, we can't just power it on because there's a little hacking we have to do to the VMX file before we power it on. A VMX file is a text file that describes the details for a virtual machine. And if we just tried to power on this vCenter server appliance deployed in VMware Workstation, we would have some failures. So the hack, if you will, portion of this nugget is how we're going to edit that VMX file before we power it on for the first time and add a few lines so that it will boot up and function correctly in our vSphere environment. And for those of you who also want to deploy the vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine in VMware Workstation, I will include the edits that we're going to be making together in this nugget for the .vmx file. I'll include those changes as part of the Nugget Lab files, so you can have those for your reference and make those changes as well. So our first step is going to be to connect to the ESXi host using the Windows vSphere client, and that's what we're looking at right here. I'm going to connect to the IP address of ESXi1. We'll log in as root with the password that we have for root, and then we'll power down this vCenter server virtual machine that's running on ESXi1. So we'll log on as root, and with the password provided, we'll go ahead and click on Login. So here we have the IP address 192.168.1.101, which represents host ESXi1. We'll expand that, and here's our single virtual machine so far, and that's the vCenter server appliance. So with that selected, we'll right-click, we'll select Power, and then from the further submenu, we'll go ahead and select Shut Down Guest. And this is a great time to talk about the difference between shutdown and power off. A power off action, this guy right here, is just like pulling the power from the device. It's not very healthy for any operating system just to have the power pulled, because there could be files and other content that hasn't been written permanently to disk. It's always a good idea to give a virtual machine or any machine a chance to gracefully shut down. And that's why this option right here, Shut Down Guest, is a better option. And if we have virtual machines where the VMware tools has been installed on those virtual machines, which also applies, by the way, to our vCenter server appliance, the VMware tools are part of that virtual machine based on how it was packaged and deployed in our VMware environment. So when we issue the command shutdown guest, we have a confirmation message we'll say yes to, and it gracefully does a shutdown of that device. So if we go to the console of the vCenter server appliance, we can see it doing a graceful shutdown of the appliance. So it is on its way down. When it's complete, it'll be completely shut down. So in the VMware client that we're currently using to connect to ESXi1, we can go to File and click on Exit to exit the Windows client. Our next step is to go to the PC that is running VMware Workstation, and on this PC, we're going to extract the files from the ISO image for the vCenter server appliance, and we're going to find the OVA file and add the OVA extension to that file. And then we'll use that vCenter server OVA file to import that into VMware Workstation. As part of the vSphere evaluation, I have downloaded several files from VMware as part of the evaluation, and one of those was this ISO image right here called VMware-vCSA-all-6.xx- and a whole bunch of numbers.iso. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into the details of that ISO. Now I'm currently on Windows 8, so when I double click on this ISO, it takes me to the E drive as if this ISO is mounted on the E drive of my local computer. So your results may vary just a little bit as you expand the contents of this ISO file for the vCenter server appliance. And as we go down further, I'm going to double click on this folder called vCSA. And in this vCSA folder, there is a file called VMware-vCSA, and it is about 1.8 gigs in size. That is the OVA file. It simply doesn't have the OVA extension. So what we're going to do is we are going to right-click on this file and select Copy. And then we're going to put this in some folder where we have read and write access to it so we can add the .ova extension. So back on my Y drive, I've got a folder called temp, and I'm simply going to right click and then paste that file there. And the reason I want that file on the location on my file system where I can change it or write to it is because I need to add the .ova extension. So we'll modify the file name and put a .ova at the very end. So from right here, if we wanted to, we could just double click and that would begin the import into VMware Workstation. Or we could go back to VMware Workstation, do File Import, grab this file, and that would also start the import. So here, let's just double click on this file, VMware-vCSA.ova, and that begins the import process. So we can name it what we want. We can also specify the location in the file system where we want VMware Workstation to keep the files associated with this virtual machine, including the hard drive files and the configuration file, the .vmx file associated with this virtual machine. So to keep this tidy, I've got an X drive, which is a terabyte in size, and I've got a folder called vSphere 6 VMs, and then I have a folder that I'm currently using, one for Active Directory Virtual Machine, one for ESXi1, one for ESXi2, and I'm simply going to click on the button to make a new folder, and I'll simply call this folder vCSA and press enter. So this is the location in the file system that VMware Workstation is going to use to store the files for this new virtual machine, this vCenter server appliance that we're importing right now. So we'll click on OK, and then we'll click on Import. Now, as part of the OVA, VMware has built in this license agreement, so we would read through all that, or have somebody read through all that, and then click on Accept if we want to continue. And then, depending on the speed of your drives and what else is going on, this could take just a minute or two for the import of this vCenter server appliance to be imported into VMware Workstation from the .ova file as our source. Okay, the import is done. I'm going to go ahead and drag this up and just put it in the same folder with the other vSphere 6 virtual machines. So you'll notice this has a whole bunch of hard disks. It's got a network adapter. And while we're right here, let's go ahead and edit the settings for that network adapter to make sure that it is going to be put into VMnet 0, which is the 192.168.1 network. So there's two ways we could do that. You could right click here and go to settings, that would do it, or you could just go ahead and click on the network adapter here and that would take us there as well. So regarding this network adapter, the bridged option actually would work, but to make it consistent, we'll go ahead and say we want to associate with VMnet 0, which is also bridged out to the 192.168.1 network. And this is going to want to have 8 gigs of RAM with 2 processors. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Now here's the tricky part. Before, my friend, before we power up this virtual machine, we need to go and edit the VMX file. That's the descriptor file for this virtual machine in order for it to work. And that's the hack part of deploying a vCenter server appliance in VMware Workstation. We have to add some components through a text editor, such as Notepad, if we want it to work. So what we'll do is we'll go in the file system to the location that's being used to store those files. And in our case, that was on my X drive under the folder called vSphere 6-VMs in a folder called vCSA. So here in the file system, here I have my VMware-vCSA.vmx file, and that's the file that we're going to edit with Notepad. So we'll right click on this file, and I don't want to open it with VMware Workstation. I want to go ahead and open it with, and I'm going to select Notepad. Now, one of the files that I've included as part of the Nugget Lab files is this one right here. This is the added text for vCenter Server Appliance in Workstation.txt. If we look at the details of that, these are the lines, there's 8 of them, that we're going to add to the VMX file for our vCenter Server Appliance that's currently sitting, not yet powered on, in VMware Workstation. As a quick rundown, this is setting the password for the administrator account. And by default, it'll be using a domain of vsphere.local. And we could also change that domain here if we wanted to as well. The IP address that we're going to assign this vCenter server appliance is an IPv4 address of 192.168.1.112. There's a 24-bit mask. The DNS server is 1.111. That's our Active Directory server that's also providing DNS services. The default gateway is 192.168.1.1. And the password for the root user we're also going to set to nugget exclamation mark 23 with a capital N at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and simply copy all of these lines. I'll right click and select copy to put them in my buffer. I'll minimize that text document. And now we'll edit our .vmx file that's being used for the vCenter server appliance. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. And at the very bottom, I'm going to do a Control V to paste in that content. We also could have done a right click and a paste, and that would have also done it for us. And then we'll save this by using the File menu and selecting Save. Now back in VMware Workstation, we can go ahead and select that VMware vCenter Server Appliance virtual machine and power it up. I'm going to go ahead and let it accept all of the defaults here. And then in my experience, and I've done this like 2 or 3 times just to verify that it would work correctly, it's going to take somewhere between like 10 and 30 minutes for this to complete. And of course, you and I are not going to have to stare and watch this entire install. What we'll do is, through the magic of editing, we'll come back when the installation is complete, and then we'll continue on from that point. It has been at least 30 minutes since I came back and checked on this machine, and it is done installing. So here's our VMware-vCSA in VMware Workstation, and we have this beautiful screen indicating this the vCenter Server Appliance version 6. The type is vCenter Server with embedded platform services controller. So let's test this out. I have a shortcut right here that'll take us to it. It's https://vcsa.nuglab.local/vsphere-client. Same URL we used previously when the vCenter Server Appliance was running as a VM on ESXi. So we'll go ahead and select that. It's also likely we're going to have some certificate warnings because it's using a self-signed certificate that our browser cannot validate. So you can go ahead and accept and continue through those. And let's now log in as administrator at vsphere.local. In the VMX file, we did not specify a domain, so vsphere.local is still the domain, and the password is the password that we specified of nugget !23 with a capital N, and we'll click on login. And lo and behold, we're connected to the vSphere web client, which is integrated and working with as part of vCenter Server. And the vSphere web client is going to be the main tool that you and I are going to be using as we administer and work with a vSphere environment. In this nugget, we've walked through the steps to deploy the vCenter Server Appliance as a virtual machine in VMware Workstation, as opposed to having it deployed as a VM inside of one of our ESXi hosts. And again, for the lab purposes, for our purposes, it's much more convenient to have it up there in VMware Workstation as opposed to, for lab purposes, nested inside of one of our ESXi hosts as a VM there. And it is quiz time. Question number 1. Where can you get the edits for the VMX file, the hack that we had to do to the VMX for the vCenter Server Appliance before powering it on in VMware Workstation? And the place you can get those is the Nugget Lab files. I will include those as part of the Nugget Lab files that you can download associated with this course. Question number 2, why did we copy the OVA file to a read-write disk on the PC? As part of the process, we extracted or expanded the ISO image, and then we copied that one file over to a read-write disk. Why did we do that? And if you're saying, Keith, I got it, it's because we had to add a .ova extension to it so we could import it into VMware Workstation. If you said that or if I said that, either way, it's absolutely true. That's why we moved that file from the ISO image over to a disk location where we had read and write access to it. And question number 3, what is the benefit of running the vCenter Server Appliance on VMware Workstation in our lab environment? And I just wanted to reinforce that one more time, that in a production environment, there's absolutely no problem in running the vCenter Server Appliance as a VM on an ESXi host. But for our lab and for practicing, if we ever need to power down or change the settings on one of our ESXi hosts, we do not want to lose functionality at any step due to the ESXi host that was running our vCenter Server Appliance being brought down. Hey, thanks for joining me for this nugget. Now, if you do decide to deploy the vCenter Server Appliance, as we did in this nugget, on VMware Workstation instead of inside of an ESXi host, please remember to turn off, to power down the vCenter server appliance that is currently running on the ESXi host, because you don't want to have two vCenter server appliances, both with the same addresses by the way, that are competing for that IP address. So at the end of the day, regardless of which one you decide to use, make sure you don't have two that are up and running at the same time. Again, thanks for joining me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.